He had a habit of spinning in circles just to see if the compass needle would stay still. That's the last image I have of him barefoot in the yard, the tiny keychain swinging from his belt loop, pointing north like it always did. I told him not to go far. I turned my back for 4 minutes. When I stepped outside, there was only quiet. The compass was gone. The whistle lay in the dirt, and the forest hadn't made a sound. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments, and if stories like this ever brushed close to your own life, go ahead and tap like and subscribe. Every click helps keep their names alive. My name is Linda Carver. I was 39 when my son disappeared. I've lived in Asheville my whole life. You can see the Blue Ridge Mountains from just about any window in town, and for the longest time I thought that was a blessing. We were in a quiet neighborhood tucked on the southern edge of the city, just far enough out to hear the cicadas in the summer and see the deer slip between trees at dusk. It was just me and Eli. His dad passed when he was 2. We did okay. I worked mornings at a place called Birch and Willow, a little cafe off Main Street with checkerboard floors and good coffee if you caught it fresh. Mornings were early, evenings were slow. We had our routines, brushing teeth to the same old radio station, Saturday library runs, popcorn movie nights on the couch. Eli was a curious kid. Smart, a little quiet around strangers, but with a wild streak once he got going. He loved maps, loved anything with direction or measurement rulers, yardsticks, compasses. I bought him a little plastic one at a flea market when he was 6 just to keep his hands busy. 2 years later, he still wore it clipped to his belt loop like it meant something. Maybe it did. Every Thursday after school, we walked the Greenway Trail by the river. He liked to time how long it took a stick to float around the bend. Said the water knew more than people did. I used to tell him, "Don't go where the water goes unless you know where it's going." He'd nod like I was telling him a secret. The last few weeks before it happened, I remember Eli had started waking early. He said the birds were louder than usual. I didn't think much of it. He'd stand by the back window sometimes, just staring into the trees. I asked him what he was looking at, and he'd say, "Nothing. Just checking which way is north." Looking back, there were other small things. The porch light flickering even after I replaced the bulb. The cat refusing to go past the fence line at night. A smell one morning like burnt metal or cold smoke just for a second when I stepped outside to get the paper. Still nothing that stopped life. Nothing that screamed. Until that morning in October. I was on the phone with my vendor delivery mix-up on the bakery order. Eli asked if he could play in the yard just to the edge where the trees begin. I told him yes. I told him only the edge. He promised. I remember the screen door swinging shut behind him, the sound of his sneakers squeaking on the tile, the whistle on his lanyard tapping his leg. I finished the call, checked the clock. 4 minutes had passed, and when I opened the door, he wasn't there. I stepped off the porch before I even realized I was moving. The phone was still in my hand. I think I dropped it somewhere by the screen door. My eyes scanned the yard like they could force him to appear, like if I just looked in the right direction hard enough, he'd be standing there, spinning his little compass like always. But the grass was still. The edge of the woods looked no different than it had any other morning. The only sound was a lawnmower a few houses down, and the wind nudging the branches like it didn't know what had happened. I called his name once, then again louder. I walked to the fence, half expecting him to jump out and yell boo the way he used to. But the leaves didn't move, and the quiet didn't break. The whistle was near the base of the fence, the lanyard snapped clean through. His sneakers left the faintest trail of crushed blades. Beyond that, the ground turned to mulch and moss. I remember thinking I couldn't follow him in slippers, but I stepped in anyway. It wasn't panic yet, not quite. It was something lower, like my gut had dropped 2 inches and wasn't coming back up. I called out again. A few birds lifted off, startled. Nothing else moved. The trees ahead thickened fast, like they always did. We'd walked that edge of the woods together dozens of times. He knew better than to go in. but still I started walking. I didn't go far, maybe 30 yards, just enough to know I couldn't see him, couldn't hear him. That's when my hands started to shake. I turned around and went back to the house, tracking mud across the kitchen floor without noticing. I hit redial, told the bakery vendor I had to call them back, then I dialed 911. The police came fast. It's a quiet part of Asheville, and calls like that don't happen often. I remember the cruiser pulling up sideways in the gravel, 2 officers stepping out. One of them tried to smile. The other already had his radio out. I showed them the fence line, the whistle, the direction I thought he went. They asked what he was wearing. I told them red hoodie jeans, the little compass keychain, though I didn't know if he still had it. I remember how quickly things shifted. Radios barked, more cars arrived, a search perimeter was set. Someone brought in a bloodhound from the next county. I stood by the mailbox with my arms crossed so tight they started to go numb. A neighbor brought me a jacket I didn't realize I needed. By that afternoon, there were volunteers combing the trails, calling his name. Flashlights flicked through the trees even before the sun went down. A helicopter came at dusk, loud and low. I thought that would be the moment he'd be found, like the sound would scare him out of hiding. But it passed, and the woods stayed quiet. They set up a mobile command unit in the church parking lot. The sheriff's department brought maps. The trails were divided into grids. Every volunteer got a section. They asked for a recent photo. I gave them the one from his last birthday frosting on his cheek, 8 candles burning behind him. They made copies, taped them to windshields and telephone poles. It all happened so fast and not fast enough. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a police scanner turned low. Every time it crackled, I held my breath. But the updates were routine, nothing found. Teams regrouping, more volunteers arriving in the morning. The rain started after midnight. Just a light mist, but enough to make me worry. He didn't have a jacket. I kept seeing his face the way he looked that morning. Hair-messy eyes, squinting in the sun, shoes untied. I pictured him cold, scared, hiding. I told myself he'd find a spot to wait, that he remembered what the ranger had told his class about stopping if you got lost. By day 3, the press had picked it up. Local news vans set up across from the church, reporters with umbrellas and cameras. A woman in a blue blazer asked if I'd speak. I said no. The look in her eyes told me that was the wrong answer for her segment. They kept showing the same photo, Eli with the red hoodie compass clipped to his side. That image became a kind of currency, passed from hand to hand. A face you might see at a gas station or along a hiking trail. Strangers came from other counties to help search. I tried to thank them. I don't remember if I managed. The days blurred. There was always movement boots in the mud drones above the tree-line, clipboard updates every few hours, but no answers. A pair of socks was found near a creek bed, but they weren't his. Someone spotted a boy outside a Walmart in Tennessee, but it turned out to be nothing. A whisper, then gone. On day 9, they brought in cadaver dogs. No one told me directly, but I saw the handlers. I saw the change in how the deputies moved, like they didn't want me to notice the shift. I started staying away from the church lot. I helped organize food for the volunteers instead, anything to keep from falling apart. By the 2nd week, the search began to wind down. Not officially. They never say that outright. But people went home. The trail maps came down. The tents were folded. A detective stopped by the house and used the word suspended. It meant they'd follow up on leads, but the active grid searches were over. I nodded. He didn't stay long. After that, the silence came. The kind that doesn't break even when the house creaks or a phone rings. The kind that settles in the corners and lingers on your clothes. I still called the station every few days. Still walked the fence line. I cleaned Eli's room every Sunday morning just like I always had. I told myself I was keeping it ready. His posters were still on the wall. the blue blanket folded at the end of his bed. The compass's twin, the one I used to keep in the glove box, rested on the dresser untouched. I picked it up once and tapped the glass. The needle trembled, then pointed north. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I realized something had shifted in town. People looked at me differently, not unkindly, just with distance. Like grief had made me porous, and they were afraid of what might seep out. At the cafe, regulars stopped asking. A few brought flowers or cards. Others just left bigger tips and hurried off. No one said his name. I started to understand that they thought the story was over, that I was the only one still waiting. But I wasn't done. I couldn't be. I joined a search and rescue group not in the field but with phones and maps cataloging tips that mostly led nowhere. Most of the calls were accidents. Someone thought they saw something. Someone heard something strange, a kid matching his age on a bus, but every now and then one would hit harder. A man who swore he saw a teenager walking along a back road near the ridge. A woman who mailed in a backpack she believed was his. It wasn't. I still kept it for a few days before mailing it back. I remember the call that should have felt like every other one. Routine. Probably nothing. I had just finished my shift at the cafe, burned my thumb on a tray of croissants. It was a Wednesday, rain in the air, but not falling yet. My phone buzzed unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I didn't. I answered, and a steady voice on the other end said, "Ms. Carver, this is Ranger Daniel Harris with the Pisgah District. I was out on maintenance near Bent Creek this morning. We found something. I think you should come in." My first thought was another hoax, another piece of something that wasn't his, but then he added, "It's a compass. Looks like it belonged to a child." And in that moment, I couldn't feel my hands. The ranger station was set back from the road, half shaded by tall pines, and wet with the kind of light that makes colors feel colder than they should. I pulled into the lot slower than I meant to, gravel crunching under the tires, every motion a second behind what my body normally knew how to do. The building was simple brown siding, small flagpole, a porch with 2 wooden steps. Inside, the lights hummed faintly, and everything smelled like old maps and coffee. A woman at the desk looked up when I entered, didn't ask my name, just pressed a button and said, "Ms. Carver's here." I stood there with my hands wrapped tight around my purse strap until Ranger Harris appeared at the hallway door. He looked older than I remembered, grayer at the temples, but his posture hadn't changed. He walked like someone who was used to moving carefully through places most people don't go. In his left hand was a clear evidence pouch. Inside was something small, round, and dull with wear. He didn't speak right away, just held it out so I could see. My eyes dropped to the plastic. The compass was scratched, the glass a little cracked, but I knew it. I knew it like you know your own handwriting or the sound of your child breathing in the next room. I reached out, hesitated, then took it, fingertips brushing the plastic like it might vanish. There was a line of engraving along the side. Not fancy. Just shallow block letters from one of those mall kiosks that used to be everywhere. E.C. My throat tightened. I didn't ask how he found it. I just whispered, "This was Eli's." Ranger Harris nodded, one of those small movements people make when there's nothing else they can do. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a radio went off down the hall. Static, then a voice, tinny and too fast. "Unit 3 to base. We've got a possible contact near Marker 7. Repeat. Teen male requesting help, says he needs his mom." I didn't feel my legs go weak, but they did. I grabbed the counter behind me and didn't speak. I didn't move until Harris did. He was already turning, already walking fast, voice clipped as he radioed back for confirmation. A deputy passed us on the way out. His face didn't hide much. That's what I remember. Nobody trying to be careful. Not anymore. Harris looked back at me and said, "You need to come with us, but we can't confirm anything until we know more." I nodded, even though I didn't hear most of the words. The air was wrong in my ears, like I'd ducked underwater. I followed him to his truck and climbed in without speaking. The drive to Bent Creek Spur felt longer than I knew it was. The rain had started again, thin but steady, and the wipers pushed it back and forth like they couldn't decide which way to clear. I held the pouch in my lap. My hand was steady, which surprised me. Harris didn't speak much, just listened to the updates coming through the radio. Subject calm, disoriented. Male late teens. Torn clothing. Asking for his mother. I swallowed hard. He didn't say the name. I waited for it anyway. The road narrowed, turned to dirt, the trees crowding close. When we pulled up to the clearing, the floodlights were already up. Rangers and deputies moved in practiced circles, quiet but alert. One of them waved us in. Harris cut the engine and turned to me. "Stay in the truck until we verify." I shook my head. He didn't argue, just opened the door. Then I heard it. A voice, not a radio, not a ranger, thin and raw like it hadn't been used in a long time. "Mom." I ran. I couldn't tell you how I got through the trees or over the mud. Just that suddenly I was in the clearing, and there he was. A boy, taller than I remembered. Gaunt, pale hair, longer face, sharper, but the eyes. The eyes were his. Eli's eyes. Wide and searching and not quite believing what they saw. He stumbled toward me and I caught him just before his knees buckled. He smelled like wet leaves and rust. His arms wrapped around me so tight I couldn't breathe and I didn't care. His voice was muffled against my jacket. "Mama, I found you." I didn't speak, just held him like I was afraid the air would steal him again if I let go. I don't know how long we stood there. It felt like one long exhale. Eventually I pulled back just enough to look at him. His lips trembled. I asked, "Where have you been?" His answer was a whisper. He told me I couldn't leave. Something in the clearing changed then. A pause. Harris stepped forward, quiet. "Who told you that, Eli?" The boy looked past us toward the tree line. His eyes shifted like he was expecting something to be watching. Instead of answering, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something in my hand. A scrap of paper. Brittle. Smudged ink. The words still readable. "Stay quiet. They're not safe." My hand closed around it fast. Harris saw it. I know he did, but he didn't ask. Not yet. They moved us back to the station, gave Eli a cot dry clothes water. He drank only after I sipped first. Refused food at first, stared at it like it was a trick. A detective from Asheville PD arrived. Middle-aged, calm voice, notepad already open. He asked if we could begin questions. I didn't like it, but Harris said we'd take it slow. The first question was basic. "Eli, do you know what year it is?" He hesitated, then said, "It's 2013. I felt my heart drop. The detective looked at Harris. I squeezed Eli's hand. "It's 2023, sweetheart." His eyes widened. His shoulders curled in like he was shrinking. I didn't know he whispered. We didn't have calendars, just trees. The next question came more gently. "Who kept you there?" Eli looked down. His hand twitched toward his pocket again. "I already had the note." He whispered. "He said if I told he'd hurt you." I kept my voice steady. "Who, Eli?" But he just shook his head. The tears gathered. He didn't cry loud, just let them fall. That night, while he finally slept under a borrowed blanket, I sat across from Harris in his office. We placed the note between us. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, folded and refolded. Harris said if this was written recently, it wouldn't look like this. This has been with him for a long time. I nodded, staring at the shaky handwriting. Someone had kept my son hidden for 10 years. Someone had told him the world wasn't safe. Someone had written down the rules to make sure he believed it. Harris leaned back in his chair. He's still scared, which means whoever did this might still be out there. The air in the room was still. You could hear the rain hitting the gutters outside. I looked past him out the window. A flash of lightning cut across the ridgeline. For 10 years I'd begged those mountains to give him back. Now they had, and he hadn't come alone. He slept most of the next day. The nurses said that was normal, that after prolonged trauma and malnourishment, the body needs time to reset. Still, I checked on him every hour. Sat beside his cot in the back wing of the ranger station, the little room they used for overnight hikers with twisted ankles or bad reactions to bee stings. Someone had set out a folded blanket and an unopened granola bar on the chair. The light above his bed was soft and the blinds stayed closed. Every time his breath hitched or his legs twitched under the covers, I braced. But he never woke screaming, not then. Just a kind of murmured tension, his mouth moving without sound, his hands curling into the fabric like he needed to grip something to stay tethered. I stayed there until late afternoon just watching, afraid that if I left the room I'd come back to find the cot empty. Ranger Harris knocked lightly and motioned for me to step out. There was an officer from Asheville PD waiting in the hallway. They'd assigned him to Eli's case. Detective Nolan. Mid-50s steady voice, the kind of man who wore quiet like a uniform. He asked if we could talk in one of the side offices. I followed him in and we sat across from each other like we were in a library, not a station. He had a yellow legal pad already filled with notes I couldn't see. He said, "We'll move slow. He doesn't need to give us everything at once. But the more we understand, the better we can protect him." I nodded through the word protect made my jaw tighten. Eli woke around dusk. He sat up slowly, blinking like the overhead light was too much. I brought him water, and this time he drank without hesitation. I asked if he wanted food. He shook his head. I told him Detective Nolan was here to help. His eyes darted to the corner of the room like he was expecting someone else to be there. When the detective stepped in, Eli watched him without blinking. He didn't flinch, just folded his hands in his lap and waited. The first few questions were simple. "Do you know your full name? What town are we in? Do you recognize me from before today?" He answered quietly, like he was unsure if his words were allowed. Then Nolan asked, "Where were you living?" Eli looked down. His fingers brushed the hem of the borrowed sweatshirt he'd been given. "In the woods," he said. "Not always. Sometimes a shed, sometimes a room with no windows." I asked him whose shed. He shook his head. "I didn't know. He never said." Harris was outside the doorway listening but not stepping in. Nolan asked, "Was it always the same person with you?" Eli hesitated, then nodded. "Mostly." That word caught. Mostly. Over the next few days he told us more, but not in a straight line. He'd talk for 5 minutes, then shut down for hours. He described the trees in detail, how their branches moved differently depending on the season, how certain bird calls meant he should stay still. He talked about a lantern one that hissed softly and never burned out. He said it was the only light allowed after sundown. I asked about the man who carried it. "Did he hurt you?" Eli didn't answer that question. He just said, "He didn't let me talk, and I wasn't supposed to look at people." Nolan asked if he remembered any landmarks, a road, a sign, a building. Eli said there was a shed with green paint that peeled like bark, a bucket of water with a ladle nailed to the post. His descriptions were detailed but disjointed, like someone had broken up time into pieces and shuffled the order. Harris started marking locations on a map working outward from Bent Creek Spur. They checked cabins, backwoods, shacks, anything half forgotten in those ridgelines. In town, rumors spread fast. The cafe where I worked had people lingering at tables longer than usual, speaking in lowered voices. I stepped in one afternoon just to grab my last paycheck, and 2 women at the register stopped talking when they saw me. One offered a smile that was more apology than kindness. The other asked if I'd heard the theory about the hermit who lived past the quarry, the one who never answered his door but always had groceries delivered to the edge of his drive. I nodded like I hadn't already heard his name. Thomas Gray. People said he'd been strange for years, built his own shutters, never paid with a card. Some thought he was just private. Others thought he was hiding something. Harris took that name seriously. He and another ranger drove up to Gray's property a day later. The drive was narrow and washed out in places, but the mailbox was still there. So was the cabin. The chimney was cold, no smoke. The windows had plywood inside. They knocked, circled the property, called out. No answer. Out back, they found a small shed. The padlock was newer than the rest of the structure, shiny, unweathered. They didn't break it open. Not yet. No warrant. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He sat up in the cot, knees pulled to his chest. I sat across from him with a warm washcloth and tried to get him to rest. He looked past me toward the blinds and said, "He's not gonna like that you came." My chest went still. I asked, "Who?" He paused, then said, "The man with the lantern." He said it like a name, like a title. I asked what that meant, but he wouldn't explain. Just lay back down and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, I told Harris. He didn't write it off, just said, "We need to know more." But that's a thread we pull. The police got their warrant 2 days later. I didn't go with them, but I heard the results before the end of the afternoon. The shed behind Gray's place held an old cot, 2 stained blankets, a bucket, and a box of rusted food cans. On the wall, they found a faded calendar each month marked with shaky X's. There was a drawing, too. Stick figures, 1 tall, 1 small. The words written in blocky letters, me and him. That was when the detective called me back in. I didn't want Eli to see it, but he did. They showed it to him in a folder. He studied it quietly and said I drew that. I asked him why. He didn't look at me when he answered. He said if I drew it, it would be more real. That's how I'd remember who I belonged to. That was the first time Harris broke his silence. He stood from the back wall and asked, "Do you remember his name?" Eli's hands clenched. He shook his head. He never let me use it. Just said he was the one with the lantern. Just sir. Nolan ended the interview there. Said we'd done enough for one day. As we were leaving, Eli paused in the doorway. He looked back at the calendar, then he whispered, "Some nights I think the trees watched." That line stuck with me. It still does. Harris and the others kept pulling threads, interviews, property records, satellite maps. But I could feel the shape of something bigger forming behind all of it. Something with no clear face. Just a flicker of light where it shouldn't be. Just a shadow that didn't move until you looked away. The line about the trees stuck with me more than it should have. I kept thinking about how a child learns to make sense of fear, how they build symbols out of whatever the world gives them. If the man with the lantern couldn't be named, then maybe the forest became the only thing left that could witness. That thought rattled around as I watched Detective Nolan circle names on his notepad, and as I trailed Ranger Harris out to the cabin again, 2 days later, this time, with proper entry permission and backup. The place hadn't changed. The grass was still trampled from our first search, but the air felt flatter now, like the woods themselves had gone quiet. Harris led the way past the empty porch and down to the shed again, where the door hung slightly ajar from the last warrant execution. This time I followed him in. The air inside was stale, but not rancid, just old. The cot had been stripped, and most of the personal items were boxed and tagged, but a few things remained things they hadn't logged yet because they weren't sure what they were. One of those was a small stack of folded paper yellowed with age hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. I found it while tracing my fingers along the inside beam near the cot. Something about the dust there looked too clean, too recently disturbed. I pulled at the edge, and the board shifted just enough to slide 2 fingers behind it. The papers came out curled, wrapped in twine. Back in the ranger office, Nolan laid them out under better light. There were 6 sheets in total, each about half the size of a normal page, like someone had torn them from a larger notebook. The writing was small and neat, but halting, like whoever wrote them had to pause and listen between lines. Some were letters, some were lists, all unsigned. One page read, "If I forget the names again, remind me." The first was in the blue shirt. The second cried too much. Third one made it out, I think. Another was a list of dates, all roughly 2 to 3 months apart, stretching back at least 5 years. Harris marked them down and started matching them to missing persons bulletins. Not every date had a confirmed match, but enough lined up that we knew this wasn't just Eli's story. There were others. We just hadn't found them. Eli hadn't spoken much that week. He'd withdrawn again, spending more time with the blankets pulled over his head than sitting up. I waited for the right moment, and when it came, mid-morning, soft light through the blinds, I asked him if he'd ever seen other children. He nodded slowly, but only sometimes. He didn't like us talking to each other. I asked what happened to them. He looked down at his hands, then up at the far wall like he was seeing through it. One stopped coming back. I think she ran. Another got sick. He said we weren't allowed to help. That was the first time I saw his jaw clench, like anger was finally stronger than fear. I asked if he remembered any names. He said Sarah. Maybe. Or Sarah Lee. Like the box. He laughed once, short and sudden, like it startled him. She said that was her joke. I'm Sarah Lee, like the dessert. Then he was quiet again. But that was the opening we needed. The name Sarah or Sarah Lee went into Nolan's search. He cross-referenced open missing child cases from the Southeast, going back 15 years, narrowed to those between 6 and 12 with any connection to North Carolina or Eastern Tennessee. One file stuck out. Sarah Kintrell disappeared in 2014 from a campground near Boone. 8 years old. Her parents had left her in the care of an older cousin while they went to refill water jugs. The cousin swore she'd only turned around for a minute. A police search lasted a week. No leads, no body. The only item found was a torn piece of a pink hoodie caught on a branch 50 yards from the trail. I remember looking at the picture in her file, bright blonde hair, missing front tooth, smile wider than her face, and thinking it matched Eli's age range at the time, and his tone when he remembered her. It wasn't distant. It was personal. We didn't share that with Eli right away. Nolan said he didn't want to risk planting memories, but we did ask one thing. Had the man with the lantern ever talked about rules? He had a lot of rules, Eli said. Like no looking through windows, no counting out loud, no red clothes. That last one made all of us pause. Nolan glanced at the list from the shed. One of the items read, "Red isn't allowed. Reminds them too much." We never learned what it meant, but the repetition mattered. The pattern started to speak louder than any confession. Then there was the map. Harris found it by accident folded between the floorboards under the main cabin's kitchen counter. It had been pressed flat inside a manila envelope, and the paper was brittle from moisture. But when opened, it showed a hand-drawn layout of the forest paths, unlabeled except for a series of small X's. Some were dated, some weren't. But each marked a location near an outcropping, an old hunting blind, or a disused trail. We sent the coordinates to search teams. They flagged 2 sites worth investigating. One was an old well near a game trail. The other was a shallow pit covered by branches and leaves less than 2 miles from where we'd first spotted Eli. They found something at the pit. Not a body, not directly, but a child's shoe. Faded blue canvas, the tread nearly worn through, and initials written on the inner heel. SK. We didn't show it to Eli, but when I described it carefully, casually, he nodded. She had those. Said her mom made her write her name on everything 'cause she lost stuff too much. Then he pulled his knees up again and said I didn't think anyone would find that. I asked him why. He said, because she said the trees were too deep. They'd never let her go home. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat in my car outside the station until nearly dawn, watching the mist drift across the road. I thought about the drawings, the crossed-out dates, the idea that Eli wasn't the first and might not have been the last. The forest had held too many secrets for too long. But that shoe, that name, was a thread we could follow. And if it led where I thought it did, we weren't just chasing a missing person anymore. We were chasing someone who'd been collecting silence for years. The man with the lantern had left just enough behind, and Eli, without knowing it, had started to light the way back. The morning we got the call from Avery County, the air was just starting to lift off the ridge, the kind of early spring fog that hangs low like it's listening. A retired surveyor named Henry Dolan had taken his dog out along a disused timber trail a few miles east of the marked forest on private land that backed up against the national boundary. The trail wasn't listed on any recent maps, but Dolan had walked it years ago when the state was still contracting firebreak surveys. His dog had veered off the path near an old runoff ditch and started barking at something half buried in the leaves. At first he thought it was just trash, maybe some leftover hunting gear, but the tarp was too tightly bundled, too intentional, and the knots were still crisp. What was underneath didn't leave much to interpretation. We were on site within the hour. The team had to park on the road and hike in a quarter mile. The smell hit first even through the masks. It wasn't a fresh dump. At least 2 weeks, probably more, but the body had been sealed in plastic and canvas enough to keep most of the elements out and enough to trap the heat in. Nolan stood over the site without speaking for a long time. Harris had already radioed for the coroner. What I remember most clearly was the way the birds had gone silent, like they already knew what had happened there. The body was a male, adult, mid-40s to 50s by estimation, though decomposition made it hard to tell at first. Clothing suggested someone used to rural labor. Denim work shirt, heavy boots, utility vest, all of it worn down but not abandoned. In the vest pocket was a thin plastic case holding a burned-out lighter, a slip of folded graph paper, and a photograph. The photo was printed on cheap home stock paper and had warped from moisture. It showed a boy standing in front of a mailbox. His face was turned slightly caught mid-laugh, and in the lower corner, just barely visible, was a hand resting on his shoulder. No face. Just the hand. I didn't show it to Eli, not yet. But I recognized the mailbox from earlier search photos painted red with a bent flag and a number stenciled in block white. The cabin. It was the same one. That meant someone had kept watch, or at the very least visited after the fact. By the time the body was transferred to Morganton, rumors had started to move faster than the lab. Some of the deputies began speculating. Was it the man with the lantern? Had he died alone out there in the woods, wrapped up in his own secrets? Nolan didn't say much. He just kept going back to the photo. Why this picture, he asked out loud more than once. Why keep this? It didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like a reminder. A moment held still. Something he couldn't quite let go of. The medical examiner's report came back 2 days later. No obvious signs of trauma, no gunshot, no blunt force. But the heart had scar tissue, significant cardiac damage. There was a possibility he died of natural causes, sudden arrest under physical strain. But traces of sedatives were found in the bloodstream, enough to slow someone down, maybe keep them compliant, maybe finish the job if the heart was already weak. No ID was found on the body, no fingerprints in the system. Whoever he was, he'd made a habit of staying off-grid. We started calling in long-term missing adult males, not just in state, but broader. Nolan focused on a narrowed list men who'd gone missing in the last 10 years along routes that connected to the Appalachians. One stood out. Douglas Ames, 51, formerly employed in maintenance at a private wilderness retreat outside Asheville, went missing in 2016. Last seen by coworkers packing up his truck after a staff housing dispute. Never clocked out. The retreat was cleared out a year later for code violations. Ames's name had slipped through the cracks because no one had filed a proper missing persons report until months later. The man had no close family. The only connection we had was a former coworker who remembered him keeping to himself and that he'd once brought a young nephew out to the property without clearing it with management. That stuck with Nolan. He pulled archived personnel files and found an old ID badge photo. The resemblance to the body was circumstantial, but it gave us a direction. I brought the photo from the vest into Eli's room later that week. I didn't show it directly. I described it first mailbox boy laughing hand on his shoulder. He didn't say anything at first. Then very softly he said, "That's the day I tried to leave." I asked him what happened. He said he'd walked toward the edge of the trees during a rain break. The man was waiting there already. He said the trees didn't like it when we went too far. I asked if he knew whose hand that was. Eli looked down. His, he said. But he wasn't mad. Not that time. I showed him the photo then. He stared at it a long time. "That's me," he said, almost without emotion. "I remember that shirt." Then quieter, he said he wanted to remember me happy, so I'd stay that way. I asked if he thought the man meant it. Eli didn't answer. He just pulled the blanket up and rolled to the wall. That same evening, Harris called from the ranger station. One of his junior staff had been logging trail camera footage from the ridge perimeter, mostly wildlife activity time-stamped and stored on a loop. But one clip from 3 months earlier caught something strange. A man walking alone near the eastern boundary just after dusk. He moved slowly, favoring one leg, carried a lantern. The angle wasn't clear, and the resolution wasn't high, but there was something about the posture. The limp. The way he paused and turned slightly like he was listening for something deeper than sound. The timestamp was exactly 1 week before Eli was found. Nolan had it enhanced and archived. He didn't say whether he thought it was the same man we'd recovered in the ditch. But I knew he was thinking it. We still hadn't identified the man definitively. No dental records matched. DNA was being processed, but that could take weeks. What we did have was one last lead, a name scrawled in pencil on the back of the photo. Faded, but legible, for J. So you remember. The letter J was underlined. That was all, just an initial. But it was enough for Nolan to start digging into state records tied to the retreat Ames had worked at ownership transfers, old staff rosters, vendors. That's when he found something odd. A delivery invoice for propane tanks and canvas tarps billed to a private address 2 counties south. The name on the invoice wasn't Ames. It was James Cutler. No employment history, no vehicle registration, just a P.O. box and a history of prepaid phone cards. But the handwriting on the invoice matched the envelope we'd found at the cabin. Same slant, same open A's. We didn't know who James Cutler really was yet, but he wasn't a ghost, and he hadn't vanished entirely. Someone had used that name to keep this network going, whatever it was. The forest hadn't given up its last secret, and Eli's story wasn't finished. Not yet. The address tied to the James Cutler invoice led us to a stretch of road with no visible mailbox and no signage, just a sloping gravel drive that vanished into thick pine. It had rained the night before, and fresh tire tracks were visible all the way up, which meant someone had been there recently. Harris and I went in with county support, 2 unmarked units staged a quarter-mile behind in case anything went sideways. No one answered the door when we knocked. The property looked deserted, but nothing felt overgrown or abandoned. The woodpile had been restacked a black tarp, freshly secured with bricks, and there were 2 pairs of boots on the porch side by side, soles clean. The front door was locked, no signs of forced entry, but we obtained a warrant within the hour based on the invoice link and the DNA results that had just come back from the remains found near the ditch, partial match to a living sibling of Douglas Ames. We now had a name, and we had probable cause. The house wasn't large. 3 rooms, wood paneling, inside worn carpet. No photos, no decorations. The fridge was unplugged but had recently thawed. One bedroom was completely empty, just a thin outline on the floor where a bed once stood. In the other room we found a desk with a narrow drawer that had been pried open. Inside were blank envelopes, a roll of clear tape, and a single piece of receipt paper folded 3 times. On it, written in smudged pencil, 2 left. Both watched. Don't slip. That was all. 3 short lines. No signature, no date. Behind the house, Harris found a trapdoor half concealed by lattice. It led down into a dugout crawl space reinforced with old railroad timbers. The floor was covered in gravel and dust, but there were imprints, drag marks, and near the corner a compact pile of objects, a flashlight with no batteries, a pair of children's socks, and a small stack of cassette tapes. Most of them were unlabeled, just dates scratched onto the plastic. One was labeled with the name Jonah. Full. The handwriting was shaky, slanted but legible. We bagged everything for evidence. Back at the station, Nolan and I sat down to listen. The first few minutes of the Jonah tape were quiet, just static movement, maybe someone adjusting the recorder. Then a voice, low and hoarse. "Tell me what you remember." A child's voice answered, hesitant, tired. "The orange blanket," he said. It smelled like smoke. The adult voice asked again, slower this time. "And after the blanket?" The boy paused. "I think I was told not to tell. He said it was a test, that if I could stay quiet, we'd get to go west." The tape went quiet after that. Just the sound of breathing. A click. Then it ended. We listened to the others one by one. None were longer than 5 minutes. Most followed the same rhythm. A man asking questions in a calm, rehearsed tone. Children responding with the same mix of confusion and obedience. Some of the tapes cut off mid-sentence. Others ended with the sound of footsteps or a door closing. I don't know how long we sat there. Nolan didn't speak for a long time. Then he stood, walked into the hallway, and shut the door behind him. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the phrase on the paper. Both watched. Don't slip. Who was being watched? Who was doing the watching? I started reviewing every file we had tied to children found in that area. In the past 10 years, 3 boys had been reported missing along that corridor, and later located, one in Georgia, one just south of Roanoke and Ely. All had been found with no clear memory of where they'd been. All had been initially classified as runaways. The 2 earlier boys had been returned to family care and their cases quietly closed. I reached out to one of them, Matthew R. from Georgia, now 18. He agreed to speak with me over the phone. When I mentioned the name Cutler, he didn't react. But when I said the words orange blanket, the line went quiet. Then he said it would keep the bad dreams out. I asked who. He hung up. That was when it really settled in. Whoever this was, whoever had used the name Cutler, they didn't operate alone. The both wasn't theoretical. There was someone else, maybe multiple people. Nolan started pulling transaction records for prepaid phones linked to the P.O. box Cutler used. One number pinged near a rest stop outside Marion, North Carolina, just a week before Eli's recovery. We traced the number to a burner, but the cell tower data showed a short call made to another burner, registered near Charleston, South Carolina. That second number, through a third-party ping request, showed a pattern multiple locations up and down the southeast, all tied to rest stops, highway motels, and wooded areas. Always for short durations, never more than a few days. Whoever it was, they moved like someone avoiding detection, someone who knew exactly how long to stay invisible. Meanwhile, the photo from the vest of Eli by the mailbox was being analyzed by the lab. Digital enhancement revealed a faint reflection in the mailbox surface. It wasn't much, just a blur. But with edge detection and contrast modeling, we confirmed it was a figure standing just behind the camera. Broad frame, short cropped hair, wearing what looked like a canvas jacket. There was no way to prove it was the same man from the tapes. But it added to the pattern. Controlled settings, someone documenting their work. I don't even like calling it that work. But that's how it felt. A process, a system. Not impulse, not chaos. Routine. We issued a regional bulletin with the alias James Cutler and the image from the trail cam. No immediate hits. But a few days later, a ranger 2 states over called in, said he recognized the man's posture, not the face necessarily, but the way he walked, the limp. He'd helped detain someone for trespassing on restricted forest land back in 2013. The man gave a different name, Walter Deming. No charges were filed. He'd claimed to be surveying deer migration routes. The ranger said he remembered the man's hands were unusually clean for someone camping out. Not a single nick or stain. The old intake form still existed stored in a physical logbook. I drove out there myself. The handwriting on the form matched the invoice handwriting exactly. We now had 3 names, 3 states, a consistent movement pattern, and 2 children we could confirm had been under this man's influence. The third, Matthew, had since relocated. The fourth, we didn't know yet. But if there were tapes labeled by name, there might be more we hadn't found. More that hadn't been dumped. That's what kept me up most nights, the idea that some part of this was still active. That someone somewhere was still operating under that calm voice. Still telling a child to stay quiet, to hold the blanket tight, and wait to go west. The sheriff's office out in McDowell County contacted us late in the evening. Someone had dropped a box outside their station marked, "For Eli's People." No return address. Just a plain cardboard box sealed with painter's tape. Inside were 5 cassette tapes, a small pocket knife, and a child's hoodie folded inside out. The hoodie had no tag, but on the inside seam, just above the hem, someone had stitched a name with red thread, Nora. None of us had heard that name before. We ran it through the database of missing children and eventually found a match from 2010. Nora Leanne Billings. Reported missing from a campground in Kentucky. Never recovered. The photos showed a girl with dark eyes and a small scar above her left eyebrow. The last person to see her was her older brother, who'd gone looking for marshmallows from a supply tent. The timing lined up almost exactly with the early movement pattern tied to the burner phones before they switched over to the Cutler alias. I held that little hoodie in my hands longer than I should have. It didn't feel like evidence. It felt like something she might come back for. The stitching wasn't professional. It was done with a child's needle, crooked and uneven. But the name was clear. We digitized the tapes immediately. Only one had a label, Nora. Pre-test. That word stopped me cold. The others were dated, scattered across different months, none longer than a few minutes. The pre-test tape started with a tone like a room being calibrated. Then the same man's voice. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. She answered right away, her voice trembling but steady. "I remember the bench," she said. "I remember it had bees underneath." The man asked, "And what did we do when the bees came out?" She whispered something. He asked her to say it louder. We didn't move. "You said they'd go away if we were good." There was a pause, then the click of the recorder being stopped. That was all. The other tapes included small snippets, quiet conversations, Background noise, someone humming. The humming unnerved me more than anything. It wasn't menacing. It was calm, methodical, like someone organizing files. It made me feel like this was all part of something bigger, something that had rules. We brought in a retired forensic linguist to evaluate the man's voice, not just for identity but for origin. She confirmed a few things we'd suspected. His dialect suggested southeastern Virginia roots, but the tone control and cadence hinted at someone who'd trained his voice, military, possibly radio. It explained the restraint, the rehearsed even delivery. When she listened to the humming, though, she stopped the tape. "That's not random," she said. "That's a melody. That's Down in the Valley." She played a version on her phone, and sure enough, it matched. An old American folk song often taught in elementary schools in the 1960s and 70s. We cross-referenced that clue with one of the old logbooks from a ranger station we'd flagged in the early part of the investigation. In 2012, a man named Walter Deming had been caught humming the same tune while being cited for trespassing near a decommissioned lookout tower in West Virginia. Same name that showed up on the form with the matching handwriting. When we checked the coordinates, we found something we hadn't noticed before. That tower wasn't just a structure, it was adjacent to an old firebreak trail that had once connected to a network of service roads now mostly forgotten. One of those roads passed within 3 miles of the location where Douglas Ames's remains had been discovered. The original maps had been archived. We drove out there ourselves. The firebreak was barely visible, just a faint line in the trees. But about a quarter-mile in, we found something that didn't belong. A wooden box nailed shut, hidden under a loose plank of soil. It was maybe 2 feet long, weather-worn but intact. Inside were 4 cassette tapes, a broken Polaroid camera, and a single photo warped and sun-faded. It showed a group of children standing in a clearing, backs to the lens. They were holding hands. You couldn't see their faces, but in the background to the right, barely in frame, was a tall man in a beige jacket. The outline of his face was blurred from sun exposure, but his posture was familiar. 1 foot turned out shoulders held 2 square. We scanned the photo at every resolution we had. There was no timestamp, but on the back someone had scribbled in pen, "Successful cohort." 4 of 6 retained. That language disturbed us more than anything else. Not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. This wasn't just one man's twisted pathology. It was a system. Someone somewhere was keeping records, categorizing outcomes. 6 children, 4 retained, 2 presumably not. We brought all of it to federal attention. I met personally with an agent from the Behavioral Analysis Unit. She didn't ask many questions, just listened. When I finished laying out everything, the tapes, the aliases, the firebreak trail, the voice pattern, the box, she asked one thing. "Do you believe it's still active?" I told her yes. She nodded, then asked if we'd ever found the original camera from the vest photo of Eli. We hadn't. But we did have the film. And that night, Harris called from the lab. He'd found something. On the 3rd frame of the unused negatives, there was a faint double exposure. It looked like it had been taken accidentally. But when enhanced, it showed a pair of shoes, adult-sized boots, standing behind what looked like a child's sleeping bag. The timestamp based on the film batch matched the week Eli had gone missing, and more disturbing than the boots was what lay next to them, a notebook. The edge of it only partially visible, but the corner showed a symbol 3 interlocking circles drawn over and over. Not initials, not a name, just that symbol. It wasn't until later that we realized we'd seen it before. On one of the older tapes, just before the audio cut out, the man had whispered, almost too faint to hear, "The circle holds. Repeat the vow." It hadn't meant anything at the time, but now it did. This wasn't about children disappearing and reappearing. This wasn't about someone hiding in the woods. It was about preservation, about memory, about rituals that were passed along not through belief but through instruction, trained like a job, rehearsed like a trade. something told and retold until no one remembered where it began. That night I went back through every file we had, not looking for names or photos this time, but for circles, for any mention of vows, for someone who might have known what it meant to be retained. I don't know what I hope to find. But I do know this: if there were 6 children in that photo and 4 were kept, then we've only met 3, which means 1 more is still out there. And if they're alive, they may be the only one who remembers the beginning. Or worse, the one who was trained to carry it forward. The case was never officially closed. We turned everything over, every tape, every photo, every map, every name, and what came back was a wall of silence. The kind that doesn't say no, just says you don't need to know. A few weeks after that last cassette surfaced, I got a call from a contact in federal records. They'd flagged my name. My file was marked Observed Cooperation, not Active Status. I wasn't sure if that was a warning or a courtesy, but it meant one thing clearly: we weren't the only ones watching anymore. The firebreak trail was bulldozed, the tower razed completely. No press release, no Forest Service memo, just gone. When I asked about the box of photos, the one with the 6 children, 4 retained, I was told it had been moved off-site. No forwarding record, no chain of custody. For a while I kept trying. I drove out to that last motel we flagged in Boone, North Carolina, the one with the blue star on the room door. I stayed 2 nights. Nothing happened. But I kept waking up at 2:12 in the morning. Same time every night. I'd sit up, check the clock, and wait. Nothing. No footsteps, no humming, no knock. Just that stillness that feels deliberate, like someone letting you know you're not forgotten. I drove home after that and packed everything into 3 boxes. 1 for evidence, 1 for theory, 1 for the pieces that never fit. I haven't opened them since. I think about Eli every time I pass a school crossing sign. I think about the way his voice cracked when he asked for the red marker, like it was something he didn't usually get to ask for. I think about the bracelet, how it didn't say help or I'm here, but for the one who remembers. That still wrecks me, because memory was the only thing they couldn't take. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that's what he was trained to protect. Not himself, but the pattern, the line, the story. Some of the parents stayed in touch. Others didn't. I don't blame them. For a few, the truth was worse than the not knowing. That's the part nobody tells you about closure. It doesn't always comfort. Sometimes it just clarifies the scale of the damage. Carla Monroe transferred to missing persons in a neighboring district. She still calls me once a year, always in early spring. Clyde Dempsey passed away not long after the press conference. Left me a letter. Inside was a Polaroid of his backyard dated the day Lily came back. He'd written 3 words on the bottom. She was real, and she was. They all were. Nate, Daniel, Lily, Nora. Whatever name they were given. However long they were gone. That's what I hold on to now. Not the case files or the tape logs or the red string maps. Just that they were real, that someone loved them before all this, that someone waited, and that in the end one of them came back to tell the story. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me. These kinds of stories don't always find a neat end, but sometimes remembering is the most we can offer. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name gets left behind.